Hi guys, and welcome back. In the last video, we saw how you could use the initial delay seconds to basically pause the liveness probe until the application became up and running. Now, another kind of more logical way to do it is to create a separate type of probe known as the startup probe. And what the startup probe will do is basically kind of hold off on the liveness probe until the startup probe becomes in the healthy state. So this is kind of like just an initialization phase probe that's going to run. So when that container is spun up, it will basically use this to check to ensure that the container is healthy. And then once the container is determined to be initially healthy, then this liveness probe will kind of take over for the remainder of the life cycle of that particular container. Now, the only difference that we really have here is that we change liveness probe to startup probe, or we can actually use them together, really. And so what we're going to do is just add in a second probe here called startup probe, and we're going to be using more or less the same parameters here as we do for the liveness probe. However, you could, if you wanted to, kind of tweak the failure threshold a little bit and give it more opportunities to fail on initial startup. You could also extend the period in seconds that it's running just to kind of delay things a little bit longer. But let's go ahead and add in this startup probe to our deployment manifest. So I'm going to open up my deployment manifest over here. And after the liveness probe, I'll add in the startup probe as well. And for the startup probe, I'm going to go ahead and use HTTP GET as the probe type, and then we're going to set the port to 80 and the path to /home, and then we'll set the period seconds to maybe 3 seconds, and then we'll set our failure threshold. Actually, what's it called? Failure threshold. We'll set that to maybe 10. And so what we're basically saying is I want you to check every 3 seconds, and I want you to check up to 10 times, so 30 seconds in total, and that's going to determine the initial health of our container. So because we're adding in the startup probe here to ensure the initial health, I'm also going to delete the initial delay seconds from the liveness probe. So now we're just depending on the startup probe here to ensure that the container is initially healthy. So let's go ahead and apply this to our cluster here, and that should create me a new replica set. Let's do kubectl get replica set. And sure enough, here is our new one right down here. So we'll give that a second to spin down the old pods and spin up the new pods. And let's go ahead and do a kubectl get pod. And we're going to be looking for pods with this 659 replica set ID. And sure enough, it looks like we've got 3 running right here. So let's do a kubectl describe pod on one of those. And it looks like the startup probe is failing initially there, and that's probably just due to the startup time that the PowerShell-based web server requires here. But as you can see, the container is initialized, so even though it failed that very first time, it did eventually determine that it was healthy, and so that pod has been marked as successfully initialized, and according to the liveness probe, the container is in a ready state. So even if you see startup probe failed, that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire container has failed and needs to be restarted. It just means that the startup probe failed that very first time, and after waiting another 3 seconds for the next startup probe to run, it brought up the web application in that container, and it ran the startup probe a second time and determined that the pod and container is actually healthy. So even though that warning is out there, you can pretty much just ignore it, or you could actually set the initial startup delay so that you could, delay the probe and not get any failures in there. But just because you see that the startup probe failed once does not necessarily indicate a catastrophic failure. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.